Civilization itself seemed to be fading into quiet and shadow. In the centuries after Rome's transition, a time often recalled for its challenges, the great repositories of learning faced difficult times, and the ancient wisdom of Greece and Rome neared the edge of being forgotten. This is the story of how knowledge endured, not in grand cities, but in secluded, steadfast communities. By the end, you will understand this era not as a time of absence, but as a quiet, determined bridge that preserved our intellectual heritage and made our modern world possible. How did remote communities accomplish this profound task, and what unseen choices determined which ancient texts endured or were lost to time? When you think of a world without connection to its past, what do you wonder we might miss next? That gradual fading of light created a world of profound isolation, with the great roads falling silent and communities growing more distant. A scroll in one town became a lonely island of understanding, completely separated from another copy of the same text 100 miles away. The physical fragility of knowledge itself was now the central challenge. Manuscripts were not kept on durable servers or printed in mass editions. They were singular, hand-crafted objects. Each one was a unique artifact, written on parchment or on papyrus, a delicate paper made from reeds. These materials were vulnerable in ways we can barely comprehend today. A damp storage space could invite decay that slowly faded the ink. A small creature in a quiet room could damage a chapter of philosophy overnight. A simple hearth fire that spread just a few feet too far could erase the only copy of a historical chronicle for an entire region. This was the true crisis, a material one. The ideas of Aristotle, the geometry of Euclid, the medical insights of Galen, they were not just abstract concepts at risk of being lost to time. They were physical objects sitting on a shelf somewhere, and that shelf was in a world growing dimmer, colder, and more disconnected by the year. In this new reality, the act of reading an old book was not merely study, it became a race against the elements. Every person who could understand its language was a potential guardian, and every changing season posed a question to its survival. The continuity of thought itself now depended on the simple, physical care of fragile things. So who, in such a world, would choose to dedicate their life not to farming or fighting, but to the quiet, painstaking work of preserving pages? The wilderness called to them first, not as a library, but as a sanctuary. Before there were scriptoriums filled with manuscripts, there were caves and simple huts in the deserts of Egypt, places of radical solitude. Men like Saint Anthony sought a life stripped of all distraction, believing that in the emptiness of the desert they could confront the deepest truths of the soul. This was the eremitic ideal, the life of the hermit, a profound but intensely personal journey. Yet this path held a limitation for the preservation of something as communal as knowledge. A solitary keeper might own a single, precious text, but when his time ended, that book could simply vanish into the sands. The future of learning needed not just solitude, but community. It needed a system. This crucial evolution came through a man named Saint Pachomius, a former soldier who had a vision for a different kind of spiritual life. He founded the first Cenobitic or communal monasteries in Egypt. Here, individuals lived together under a shared rule, balancing solitary prayer with common work and worship. This model created a stable, self-sustaining society in miniature. It was a revolutionary idea that traveled across the Mediterranean, finding its most influential expression centuries later in the cool hills of Italy. There, a young nobleman named Benedict, disillusioned with the complexity of city life, retreated to a cave at Subiaco. His experience led him to write a simple, practical guide for communal religious life, known as the Rule of Saint Benedict. Its genius was in its balance and order. The day was divided into periods for prayer, for manual labor, and for sacred reading, or lectio divina. This last element, the dedicated time for reading, was the quiet, unintended spark. The rule demanded stability, a vow to remain within the community for life. This created an environment of remarkable continuity, where a project started by one monk could be continued by another decades later. Shared resources meant the community owned everything, including its books collectively. Obedience meant work was assigned for the good of all, and that work could include copying texts. Within this structured life of prayer and labor, a space for the mind was carved out not as a separate pursuit, but as an integral part of worship. To understand a sacred text was to draw closer to the divine. So the monastery, designed as a fortress for the soul, slowly, almost accidentally, began to take on the architecture of a fortress for something else. Its walls kept the world's turmoil at bay, its routines provided predictable quiet, and its vows created generations of stewards. It became the one place in a fragmented landscape where the fragile flame of a manuscript could be consistently sheltered, fed, and most importantly, copied. The spiritual quest for understanding had, without initially intending to, created the perfect conditions for a rescue mission. Benedict's rule was not a grand theory of education, but a practical guide for living together. It offered a simple, profound rhythm for the day, known as ora et labora, prayer and work. This balance was everything. The hours of prayer in the chapel gave the community its purpose, its shared heartbeat. The hours of labor in the garden or the workshop ensured its survival, its independence from a chaotic world. But woven quietly between these two pillars was a third, equally vital practice, lectio divina, or sacred reading. This was not casual browsing, but a deep, meditative engagement with a text, usually scripture. Benedict mandated specific times for this silent, focused reading, and in doing so, he created a non-negotiable daily need for the most precious resource a monastery owned, its books. This requirement transformed the collection and care of manuscripts from a luxury into a necessity. A monastery without books could not properly fulfill its rule. So, within the walls of these self-sufficient communities, a new space began to take shape, the library. It started humbly, perhaps just a locked chest or a dedicated cupboard, but it grew. And to fill it, the monks turned to their own hands. The labor of the scriptorium, the copying room, became as essential as the labor of the field. Copying a text was not mere duplication. It was an act of devotion, a literal transmission of wisdom from one generation of faithful stewards to the next. The scribe's careful pen strokes were a form of prayer, each completed page a small victory against forgetting. The rule's emphasis on stability cemented this long-term mission. A monk took a vow to remain in his community for life. This meant the young novice who began meticulously copying a gospel in his 20s might, 50 years later, be teaching another young novice from that very same volume. Projects spanned human lifetimes. A monastery could plan for a century, knowing there would be dedicated hands to continue the work. This created institutions with a memory longer than any king's dynasty. They became living archives where knowledge was not just stored, but actively used, studied, and reproduced in a continuous cycle. Benedictine monasticism, by seeking to organize a life of spiritual depth, had accidentally engineered the most resilient knowledge preservation system the West had ever seen. The quiet rhythm of prayer, work, and reading built a fortress not of stone but of continuity. But what did it actually look like inside the walls of such a place? And what was the daily reality for the individuals who became the unsung heroes of this story? The Scriptorium was a room built for a single sacred purpose: to fight the fading of memory with the most durable tool available, human attention. Located within the quiet cloisters, it was often positioned to capture the steady, shadowless light from the north, a practical choice to illuminate the work without the glare and moving shadows of direct sun. Rows of simple wooden desks faced these windows, each one a station in an assembly line of preservation. Here the skilled monk, the scribe, would spend the hours assigned for labor in a state of profound focus. His world shrank to the texture of parchment, the sharp point of a quill, and the flowing line of ink. This was not a place for haste. The entire process from raw material to finished book was a testament to patience and reverence. Before a single word could be written, the scribe needed his canvas. Parchment was not paper, it was a prepared material created through a lengthy, careful process to achieve a smooth and durable surface. His ink was not simply bought, it was often crafted within the monastery from natural sources like oak galls, mixed with iron salts to create a deep, lasting black. His pen was a quill carefully cut and shaped from the flight feather of a goose. Every element of his craft was drawn from the immediate world around the monastery, tying the act of writing directly to the land and the rhythm of the seasons. Then came the copying itself. The scribe would have before him an existing manuscript, the exemplar often secured on a stand. His task was to reproduce it letter by letter, line by line, with meticulous accuracy. He wrote in a clear, standardized script later known as Carolingian minuscule, which was designed for legibility and space efficiency. This was an act of immense discipline. A single lapse in concentration could introduce an error that might then be copied by others for centuries. The work was slow. A good scribe might complete only a few pages in a day. His hand would cramp, his eyes would strain in the fading light, and the silence of the room would be broken only by the soft scratch of the quill and the occasional turning of a page. Yet this labor was never seen as mere drudgery. In the monastic worldview, it was a form of prayer. To copy a passage from the Psalms was to meditate on each word, absorbing its spiritual meaning through the hand. To reproduce a text of ancient philosophy or science was an act of stewardship, a sacred duty to pass on enduring truth as revealed through human reason. The Scriptorium was in this sense a spiritual workshop. It was a factory for memory, but one where every product was unique, infused with the care of its maker. Within these quiet walls, the voices of Plato and Virgil, of Galen and Augustine, were not just preserved, they were given a new physical form, a new lease on life, ready to speak to a future the scribe himself would never see. The book that left his desk was a bridge across time. But this careful work of copying was only the beginning of the story, for the text itself was a living thing subtly shaped by the very hands that sought to save it. The scribe's pen was a conduit, but his mind was a filter. As he bent over the parchment, his task was far more complex than simple reproduction. He was the last living link in a chain that stretched back centuries, and with that role came a quiet, immense responsibility. The manuscript before him, the exemplar, was not a perfect original. It was itself a copy of a copy, and along its journey, small errors had inevitably crept in. A word might be misspelled, a line accidentally skipped, a passage rendered unclear by an earlier scribe's fading ink or moment of distraction. The monk at his desk had to decide what to do. Would he faithfully copy the mistake, passing it on to the future? Or would he intervene, using his own judgment to correct what he perceived as an error? This was not cheating, it was curation. In this way, every scribe became a subtle editor, a guardian of clarity as much as of content. His work often extended into the margins. Small, handwritten notes known as glosses would appear beside difficult words or complex philosophical arguments. A gloss might offer a simpler synonym, a brief explanation of a historical reference, or a cross-reference to another text. These were the scribe's conversations with the author and with future readers. Sometimes a monk would compile what he found most useful, creating new works from old ones. He might gather the best medical remedies from several texts into one practical handbook, or collect philosophical arguments on a single theme from multiple sources. This act of compilation was a form of intellectual synthesis, creating tailored libraries within a single volume. The most profound intervention, however, was translation. In much of Europe, the knowledge of Greek had faded almost completely. The profound works of Plato, Aristotle, and the Eastern Church Fathers sat locked in a language few could read. But in remote scholarly outposts, particularly in Ireland, this linguistic flame still flickered. A remarkable thinker named John Scotus Eriugena, whose name means John the Irish-born Scot, undertook a monumental task. Working in the 9th century, he directly translated the works of influential Greek Christian thinkers into Latin. This was not a mechanical word swap, it was a full intellectual migration. He had to find Latin equivalents for complex Greek philosophical concepts, essentially rebuilding the bridge of understanding that had collapsed centuries earlier. Through his work, ideas that were on the verge of becoming permanently foreign were welcomed back into the mainstream of Western thought. This editorial layer, from simple correction to full translation, was the hidden engine of the medieval intellectual revival. The texts that survived were not a random sample of antiquity. They were the texts that generations of scribes, through their daily labor, had voted most valuable, most coherent, and most necessary for their world. The monks shaped the canon by their hands. They ensured that ancient wisdom was not merely stored, but actively adapted, explained, and made ready for a new audience. The book that left the Scriptorium was never a perfect fossil of the past. It was a living document, carefully prepared by its last keeper to speak clearly to the future. And as these prepared texts began to travel, they needed a new kind of fortress, one not of quiet cloisters but of distant, windswept shores. While the scribe's hand fought decay, the monastery's very location formed its first line of defense. These communities were not built for convenience but for separation. To find them, one had to undertake a journey, leaving the familiar world behind. In Ireland, the monastery of Skellig Michael rises from the wild Atlantic, a sheer spike of rock where monks built their beehive-shaped stone huts nearly 700 feet above the crashing waves. In Italy, the mother house of the Benedictine order, Monte Cassino, was founded atop a steep mountain, a steadfast fortress of faith overlooking the valleys. In the dense forests of eastern France, monasteries like Luxeuil were established in deep woodland clearings, surrounded by miles of untamed wilderness. This was a conscious choice, a physical manifestation of the spiritual retreat from worldly chaos. The remoteness served a profound practical purpose. In an era of recurring conflict, where armies and raiding parties moved along roads and rivers, an isolated mountain or a distant island was a form of natural security. While settlements in the valleys faced disruption, a community on Skellig Michael was virtually unreachable without determined effort. The same steep paths that made bringing supplies a challenge also made it a poor target for a swift, profitable raid. The thick forest around Luxeuil provided a buffer, hiding the community from casual observation and making any organized approach difficult. The stone walls of these places were important, but the first and greatest wall was the landscape itself. This geographical strategy created extraordinary pockets of stability. For centuries at a time, while kingdoms rose and fell, and power shifted between distant rulers, the daily rhythm in these remote enclaves could continue undisturbed. The Scriptorium's work did not pause for a change in emperor or a border dispute. The careful copying of texts, the tending of gardens, the cycle of prayer, all proceeded with a continuity that was impossible in more vulnerable regions. The library was not just secured in a room, it was secured within a landscape deliberately chosen to be bypassed by history's turmoil. In this way, isolation became the guardian of connection. By stepping away from the centers of power and conflict, these communities safeguarded the very threads that connected their present to the ancient past. The quiet of a windswept island or a forest cloister was not an emptiness, but a sanctuary for the fragile voice of a 1,000-year-old text. The distance they cultivated allowed time itself to behave differently within their walls, flowing slowly enough for the meticulous work of preservation to succeed. Yet, this very success created a new consideration, for a library safe in its mountain retreat is also a library set apart from the wider world of ideas. Far from the fading light of the old Roman world, a different kind of flame was being tended. While continental Europe navigated profound change, the island of Ireland, a land Rome's legions never conquered, cultivated a monastic tradition of astonishing vitality and reach. Isolated geographically, it became intellectually central, inspired by the legacy of St. Patrick and the zeal of founders like St. Columba. Irish monks pursued learning not as a mere duty, but with a passionate, artistic fervor. Their remote monasteries were not just shelters, they were dynamos of creativity. Places like Clonmacnoise, rising from the boglands by the river Shannon, or Glendalough, nestled in a wooded valley, became famed cities of God and scholarship. They were bustling communities where stone-high crosses carved with biblical scenes stood beside round towers built for refuge and bell ringing, and where the Scriptorium was the heart of it all. Here, Irish scribes perfected a unique and breathtaking art form. They developed the insular script, a style of writing characterized by its rounded, clear letters, perfectly designed for legibility and beauty. But they did not stop with the text, they framed it. Pages became fields of intricate, swirling decoration, where Celtic knots intertwined with vibrant colors and fantastical animals. The Book of Kells, likely created on the island of Iona and later kept at Kells, is the supreme example. Its pages are a mesmerizing fusion of Christian symbolism and ancient Celtic design, where the word itself is adorned with such complexity that a single page might have taken a scribe artist months to complete. This was preservation as celebration, treating each manuscript as a sacred object worthy of the highest artistic devotion. Yet these monks were not content to simply guard their treasures in isolation. They possessed a profound restlessness for God, known as the Peregrinatio Pro Christo, a pilgrimage for Christ. This spiritual drive turned them into some of history's most remarkable travelers. A monk named Columbanus, with a small band of brothers, left Bangor in the late 6th century and journeyed across the sea to a continent still reeling from change. He founded monasteries deep in the forests of Gaul at Luxeuil and later in the mountains of Italy at Bobbio. These were not just new religious houses, they were outposts of Irish learning. The monks arrived with their precious books, their distinctive tonsure, their method for calculating Easter, and their intense scholarly discipline. In doing so, they performed a monumental, unconscious act of cultural restoration. They were reintroducing the classical learning they had so lovingly preserved back to the very mainland from which it had originated. Ireland, therefore, functioned as a kind of historical backup system. While the primary server of the Roman world experienced instability, this island at the edge of the map kept the programs running, maintained the files, and even added beautiful new code. Then, when the continent was ready, these monk missionaries began the patient work of uploading that saved data, restoring libraries, and rekindling a love for texts that had nearly been lost. They ensured the flame kept in the West could once again illuminate the East. But this story of preservation was never just about one place or one people. It was a network of quiet exchanges spanning continents, where another ancient civilization was undertaking a parallel and even more systematic rescue mission. Yet even the most remote scriptorium could not single-handedly reverse the tide of an entire continent's forgetting. For that, the quiet work of the cloister needed the authority of a crown. In the late 8th century, a king emerged with a vision that reached far beyond the battlefield. Charlemagne, ruler of the Franks, was a conqueror who built an empire spanning much of Western Europe, but his most enduring ambition was to build a new Athens, a Christian Rome of the mind. He understood that to govern such vast, diverse lands, he needed more than soldiers, he needed scribes. He needed a unified administration, a literate clergy, and a shared cultural foundation. This insight sparked what scholars now call the Carolingian Renaissance, a deliberate, state-sponsored revival of learning that would supercharge the monastic preservation mission. At the heart of this project was a partnership between the palace and the monastery. Charlemagne recruited the finest scholars from across Europe to his court, most notably Alcuin of York, a master from the renowned school of England. Together, they launched a reform as practical as it was profound. They looked at the chaotic variety of handwriting styles used across different regions and saw a barrier to clear communication and accurate scripture. Their solution was to standardize it. They championed a new, clean, and exceptionally legible script, now known as Carolingian minuscule. Its rounded, separated letters with clear distinctions between uppercase and lowercase made reading faster and copying more reliable. This script did not just tidy up manuscripts, it became the direct ancestor of the typefaces we read on screens and in books today. Every time you read a lowercase letter, you are seeing the legacy of a royal decree for clarity. But Charlemagne and Alcuin did not stop with penmanship. They issued a series of official orders known as capitularies that echoed through the empire's monasteries. They commanded the careful correction and copying of religious texts, particularly the Bible, to address inconsistencies that had accumulated over centuries. They also encouraged the preservation of valuable secular works, from Roman histories to handbooks on agriculture and architecture. Suddenly, the meticulous labor of the monastic scribe was not just a local act of devotion, it was a service to the empire itself. Monasteries like Tours, where Alcuin became abbot, or Corbie, or St. Gaul, transformed into officially sanctioned hubs of a coordinated cultural project. The king provided protection, resources, and a powerful mandate, while the monks provided the skill, the discipline, and the sacred space for the work. This royal partnership changed the scale of preservation entirely. It moved from a scattered, defensive effort to a systematic, continent-wide campaign. The scriptorium's output multiplied, and the quality of the texts improved dramatically. Libraries grew not by chance but by design. Charlemagne's Renaissance proved that the survival of knowledge required more than just safe harbor. It needed active cultivation, a society that valued its past enough to invest in its future. Quiet flame kept alive in the wilderness was now being fed and sheltered by the highest power in the land, ensuring its light would spread much further. But as this newly organized wave of learning began to flow, it would soon meet a very different tide rising from the south, one that carried not pens and parchments, but a vibrant and sophisticated intellectual tradition of its own. The story of preservation was never a solitary vigil in the West. As the monastic scriptorium flourished, two other great civilizations were engaged in their own monumental acts of guardianship, creating a far broader network that would eventually reconnect a fractured world. To the east, the Byzantine Empire stood as a living extension of Rome itself. Its capital, Constantinople, was a metropolis of staggering wealth and sophistication, where the Greek language had never ceased to be spoken in the streets or studied in the schools. Here, the classical past was not a memory to be recovered, but a continuous tradition. Imperial libraries and monastic scriptoria within the empire maintained vast collections of original Greek texts, the complete works of Plato and Aristotle, the histories of Herodotus, the mathematical treatises of Archimedes. Byzantine scholars did not just copy these works, they actively commented on them, taught them, and debated their meanings century after century. This was not a rescue mission, but a steady, unbroken conversation with antiquity that the West had largely lost. Simultaneously, and in many ways connected through trade and cultural exchange, an astonishing intellectual movement was unfolding under the Islamic caliphates. During the Abbasid Golden Age centered in Baghdad, a deliberate and state-sponsored project of translation began. Caliphs established the House of Wisdom, a grand academy that attracted the finest minds from across the Muslim world. Scholars like Al-Kindi and Hunayn ibn Ishaq led teams that systematically sought out Greek, Persian, and Indian manuscripts. They translated the works of Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, and Euclid into Arabic with meticulous care. But they did not stop there. These scholars were not passive copyists, they were brilliant innovators. They added their own extensive commentaries, corrected errors they found in the older texts, and built upon the ancient foundations with groundbreaking advances in medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. The Arabic language became a new vessel, a parallel and enriched repository for the wisdom of the ages. For centuries, these two great streams of knowledge, the direct Greek tradition in Byzantium and the synthesized Arabic tradition in the Islamic world, flowed separately from the Latin West. Then, in the 11th and 12th centuries, the waters began to mix in remarkable places of cultural intersection. In Toledo, Spain, after a shift in political rule, the city revealed a treasure trove not of gold but of books. It became a bustling workshop of translation, where teams of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars worked side by side. They translated the Arabic versions of Aristotle, along with Arabic commentaries and original works by thinkers like Avicenna and Averroes, into Latin. A similar exchange happened in the multicultural kingdom of Sicily. Here, Greek manuscripts from Byzantium and Arabic texts from North Africa were gathered and translated. This torrent of new-old knowledge did not simply trickle into Western Europe. It flooded the monasteries and nascent universities. Latin scholars suddenly had access to a vast body of thought that had been absent for half a millennium, complete with layers of new interpretation and discovery. This influx did not just add to the library, it revolutionized it, providing the intellectual fuel for the High Middle Ages and setting the stage for the Renaissance. The quiet work of the isolated scribe had kept a flame alive, but it was this reconnection with the broader world of ideas that would turn that flame into a beacon. This curation of knowledge was not a neutral act. The monks who saved our past were also, by necessity, its editors. The texts that survived the long passage through the medieval world did so not by random chance, but because they passed through a powerful filter, shaped by the priorities of the communities that preserved them. This filter had two main criteria: theological alignment and practical utility. Works that supported Christian doctrine or offered clear, usable knowledge were the most likely to be copied, generation after generation. The writings of the Church Fathers, like Augustine and Jerome, were copied endlessly, as was the Bible itself, the central text of monastic life. From the classical world, authors who could serve a purpose thrived. Cicero's works on rhetoric were preserved because they taught clear, persuasive speech, a vital skill for preaching and administration. Aristotle's works on logic were carefully studied and copied. Once scholars found ways to reconcile his methods with Christian faith, creating a foundation for medieval philosophy and theology. Latin authors writing in the language of the Church had a distinct advantage over Greek ones in Western Europe. Virgil was saved, though sometimes reinterpreted as a mystical prophet. Practical Roman manuals on farming, architecture, and medicine were valued for their immediate usefulness and survived. But this very focus meant that a staggering amount of other material slipped through the sieve. The vibrant world of pagan literature, particularly poetry and drama, largely faded from view. Many of the great plays of ancient Greece, the histories that did not align with a biblical worldview, and advanced scientific or mathematical treatises that seemed abstract or irrelevant to monastic life, simply were not prioritized for copying. Their final copies sat on shelves, growing brittle until time or circumstance took them. In a practice called palimpsesting, a scribe might carefully prepare an older, less valued text to reuse the precious parchment for a new one, making room for another voice. The modern library of antiquity is therefore a profoundly curated collection. It represents not everything the ancient world produced, but what the medieval world, for its own reasons, deemed essential to carry forward. The survival of any given text often hung by the thinnest of threads, dependent on a single copy residing in one remote library that escaped the centuries. This is the profound reality of our inheritance. We possess the works that spoke directly to the needs and beliefs of those quiet scribes in their cloisters. We glimpse only echoes of the voices that did not. So when we read the classics today, we are not seeing the full, chaotic chorus of the ancient world. We are listening to a beautiful, partial harmony, one carefully arranged and passed hand to hand across 1,000 years, a testament as much to what was cherished as to what receded into silence. The bell would wake him in the deep darkness long before the first hint of dawn. This was the first call to prayer, a communal chant in the cold chapel that anchored the entire day in devotion. For the monk whose labor was the Scriptorium, this was not an interruption from his real work, it was the foundation of it. His life was not divided into compartments of sacred and secular, but woven into a single, seamless fabric of worship. After the office, he might join his brothers for a simple meal, then move to the chapter house to hear a reading from the rule or receive instructions for the day's tasks. Then, as the sun finally crested the walls, he would take his assigned place. If his duty was in the fields or the brewery, his hands would be busy with the earth or the vat. But if his skill and the community's need placed him in the Scriptorium, his labor took a different, equally physical form. Here, the canonical hours continued to structure his focus. The period after the morning office was often dedicated to deep, meditative sacred reading. For a scribe, this practice naturally bled into his craft. Studying the text before him was the first step, absorbing its meaning and structure. Then the work of the hand began. He would prepare his parchment, rule it with faint lines using a stylus and straight edge, and mix his ink. Every movement was deliberate, a slow dance of concentration. He worked by the precious, diffuse light from a northern window, and when the days grew short or the weather turned, by the fragile, expensive glow of a candle or oil lamp. The physical demand was constant, a quiet endurance where the reward was not a finished page by noon, but perhaps a single, perfectly rendered column. This integration was the true engine. The monk did not see himself as shifting between jobs, from praying to copying to farming. In his mind, each action fed the other. The discipline of the prayers cultivated the inner quiet necessary for the intense focus of the Scriptorium. The manual labor of preparing materials, or the seasonal work in the garden that fed the community, grounded his scholarship in the tangible world. And the intellectual work of copying a philosophical text or illuminating a gospel was itself an act of piety, a tangible participation in a divine order of truth. To write a beautiful letter was to honor the word that created all things. To preserve the logic of ancient thinkers was to celebrate the human reason that reflected a greater mind. His day would be punctuated again by the calls to prayer, pulling him from his desk back to the choir. This rhythm prevented exhaustion, forcing a regular renewal of purpose. The final offices would close the day as it began, in shared chant. Then, in the silence of the dormitory, his mind might still trace the shapes of letters or the flow of an argument, a silent echo of the day's labor. This was the hidden reality, a life where every copied sentence was a prayer written down, and every prayer strengthened the hand that held the pen. The survival of knowledge was not a project they worked on, it was the life they lived, breath by breath, bell by bell, word by careful word. The book was not merely read, it was physically anchored to its home. Within the monastery's walls, the most precious room after the chapel itself was the library, often called the armarium, a word that evokes both a chest for storage and an arsenal for the spirit. Here, knowledge was treated with the same solemn care as the sacred vessels used in worship. A single volume represented an immense investment of community resources, months of labor from skilled hands, and the irreplaceable wisdom of past ages. Its value was so profound that security was not an afterthought, but a fundamental part of its preservation. In many libraries, especially those that grew to attract outside scholars, the most important books were literally chained to the reading desks or to the shelves themselves. The chain was long enough to allow the heavy volume to be lifted and studied at the desk, but not to be carried away. Other texts were kept in locked chests, their contents listed on an inventory, accessible only with permission from the abbot or the librarian monk. This was not about hoarding, but about sacred stewardship. Each book was a unique treasure, and its chain was a tether ensuring it would remain for the next seeker. The scale of these collections would feel intimate to us today. A library boasting a few hundred volumes was considered a center of immense learning and prestige. The great monastery of St. Gaul, for instance, might have held around 400 books at its height. This was not a random accumulation, but a meticulously curated collection. Every volume had a purpose. Monastic librarians created catalogues, sometimes with brief descriptive notes to guide a brother in his search. A catalogue entry might read not just Augustine, but Augustine on the Trinity, useful for understanding the divine nature. This careful organization transformed the library from a storeroom into a working instrument of education. The character of a monastery's library was deeply shaped by its community's work. A house with a renowned school, like Tours under Alcuin, would actively seek out and copy grammatical texts, works on rhetoric, and the philosophical manuscripts needed to train the mind. A monastery focused more deeply on the contemplative life might have a collection richer in mystical writings and volumes for liturgical chant. Each library became a reflection of its community's intellectual personality, a specialized garden growing certain kinds of knowledge. Access to this treasury was a privilege earned through membership and responsibility. Primarily, it served the monks of the house, supporting their daily lectio divina and the education of novices. The young monk learned to read from these chained books, his formation guided by the very texts his elders had copied. In this way, the library was the engine of continuity, allowing each generation to begin its learning not from scratch, but from the accumulated height of the one before. A few celebrated monasteries, however, became destinations. A scholar from a distant region, hearing of a rare text held at Bobbio or Reichenau, might undertake a difficult journey to consult it. He would arrive as a guest, living by the monastic rule for a time, granted the rare permission to study the chained treasure. This slow, deliberate sharing of resources wove a thin but resilient web of learning across a fragmented continent. Thus, the medieval library was far more than a passive repository. It was a sacred, organized, and active space where preservation met pedagogy. The chain that secured the book to its desk also secured the student to a lineage of thought that stretched back centuries. In this quiet room, the past was not locked away but made permanently available for conversation, ensuring that the flame of inquiry, once carefully sheltered, could now be steadily passed from one open mind to the next. A blank page of parchment was not an empty space but a sacred field awaiting cultivation. Within the Scriptorium, the scribe's work of perfect black letters was only the foundation. For the most important texts, his labor would be followed by that of a different kind of monk, the illuminator. This artist took the written word and clothed it in light, transforming the manuscript into a multisensory experience of faith and knowledge. The term illumination comes from the Latin word meaning to light up, and that is precisely what these dazzling decorations did. They made the pages glow with color and meaning, turning the act of reading into an encounter with the divine. The illuminator worked with a palette drawn from the ends of the earth. The most celebrated blue came from lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone mined only in distant Afghanistan. Ground into a brilliant powder, it produced an ultramarine blue so vivid and costly it was often reserved for the robes of the Virgin Mary. Reds were made from vermilion or crushed insects, greens from malachite or verdigris, and gold leaf was applied with breathtaking delicacy. These were not mere illustrations, they were theological arguments in visual form. An ornate initial letter at the start of a gospel might weave within its curves tiny scenes from the life of Christ, telling a story within a story. A psalm about the heavens could be framed by a border of swirling stars and celestial creatures. For a monk whose daily prayer involved slow, meditative reading, these images served as memory palaces, anchoring complex theological ideas to unforgettable visual symbols. In the Irish and Anglo-Saxon traditions, this art reached an almost hypnotic complexity. Pages like the Chi-Rho page in the Book of Kells are less a picture and more a labyrinth of devotion. The name of Christ, written in Greek, unfolds across the parchment in a riot of intricate knotwork, interlaced animals, and human figures so tiny they seem hidden. To follow a single ribbon of color is to get lost in a meditation on infinity and interconnection, a visual echo of the divine order the text describes. This level of detail was an act of worship in itself, a pouring of immense skill and time into the glorification of a single sacred sentence. This artistic splendor carried a profound, unintended consequence for preservation. A plain text on reused parchment might be seen as less permanent, its vellum sometimes prepared again for a new work in a practice called palimpsesting. But a manuscript that glimmered with gold and lapis lazuli, that represented hundreds or even thousands of hours of collective artistic labor, was transformed. It became a relic, a treasure of the community. Its beauty declared its value in a language everyone could understand, ensuring it would be protected, honored, and passed down with extreme care. The artistic investment acted as a powerful insurance policy against the passage of time. In this way, the pursuit of beauty became one of history's most effective conservation strategies. The illuminator, seeking to honor truth, also guaranteed its physical survival, wrapping fragile wisdom in a casing of such splendor that no one would dare let it fade. The permanence of a thought was only as strong as the skin it was written on. For the monks in their scriptoriums, the work to safeguard ancient wisdom began on a practical, almost elemental level. The very materials they chose reflected a careful balance between endurance and what was available, each selection speaking to their deep commitment. The classical world had favored papyrus, crafted from the reeds of the Nile, but it proved a fragile companion in the damp, cool climates of northern Europe. Papyrus becomes brittle when dry, and moisture encourages decay. It was a material for a different world, not quite right for these new guardians of learning. Their answer was both ingenious and deeply symbolic: parchment. This was not paper, but carefully prepared animal skin, typically from calves, sheep, or goats, treated through a long and meticulous process. A skin would be soaked in lime, stretched tightly on a frame to dry, and then scraped again and again with a crescent-shaped knife until it reached a perfectly smooth and even surface. The effort required was tremendous, and the expense was measured in entire herds. To create one large lectern Bible, the kind that would be placed in a cathedral, might need the skins from well over 200 animals. Every single page represented a substantial part of a community's resources, making each blank sheet a valuable canvas not to be treated lightly. Upon this durable surface, the scribe applied his ink, and here too, careful craft aided preservation. The most valued recipe was for iron gall ink, a remarkable mixture. It was made from oak galls, those curious growths formed on trees, combined with iron salts and a binder like gum arabic. This ink was cherished for its rich, lasting black color and its way of bonding with the parchment, becoming one with the material itself. Yet this very strength held a hidden challenge. Over the passing centuries, the acidic nature could slowly interact with the page it decorated, sometimes causing the writing to appear like a faint impression, a note that even their most careful methods carried a complexity. The concerns they faced were constant and ordinary. Dampness in a storage room could encourage unwanted growth. Tiny insects could find the material appealing. A significant concern in any building lit by candle and hearth was the risk of fire. In response, the design of monastic spaces adapted for protection. Libraries used raised shelves to keep texts away from cold floors and were built to allow good air movement to manage humidity. The attention given was daily and watchful, a quiet dedication against a slow tide of natural change. And when a manuscript was finally considered too worn, its text perhaps replaced by a more current copy, the community encountered a practical question. Parchment was far too precious to simply set aside. The answer was the palimpsest. Using pumice stone or a mild abrasive, a scribe would carefully clear the old writing from the surface, sometimes lightening it with gentle substances, preparing it for a new text. To the eye, the page was fresh once more, ready for a new beginning. But beneath that new layer, the trace of the old writing often lingered, softly held within the skin. Centuries later, with modern tools and careful study, scholars can sometimes rediscover these earlier texts. A forgotten play from the ancient world, an early spiritual reflection, a piece of an old legal code, all resting quietly beneath a later prayer book. The palimpsest is more than a simple curiosity. It is the perfect symbol for the age itself, a time where understanding was never truly lost, only gently covered, waiting patiently in the quiet for a future ready to bring it back to light. The most precious book in the library was useless without a mind to understand it. Preservation was not an end in itself, it demanded transmission. Within the walls of the larger monasteries, a quiet but profound educational revolution was taking place. These communities established their own internal schools, creating a living system to ensure the flame they guarded would be passed to the next generation. The students were often young boys known as oblates, children whose families had dedicated them to the monastic life, sometimes as young as 7 years old. In other cases, the monastery might also educate the sons of local nobility, forging important bonds with the secular world while spreading literacy. For these young minds, the cloister became their entire world, a total environment for formation where learning was woven into the fabric of daily prayer, labor, and community life. The curriculum they followed was not haphazard but a structured path known as the 7 liberal arts. This ancient framework, inherited from the late Roman world, was divided into 2 stages. The first was the trivium, the threefold way of words. It began with grammar, which meant far more than memorizing rules. It was the mastery of Latin itself, the key to unlocking every text in the library. Students learned by studying classical authors like Virgil and Cicero, absorbing their style and substance simultaneously. Next came rhetoric, the art of persuasive and beautiful speech, essential for preaching and for understanding legal or philosophical arguments. Finally, logic or dialectic trained the mind in clear reasoning, often through the challenging works of Aristotle. This training taught them how to think, how to argue, and how to discern truth from error. Once proficient in the trivium, a student could advance to the quadrivium, the fourfold way of numbers. This encompassed arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These were not narrow technical subjects, but studies of the fundamental patterns of creation. Arithmetic explored pure number, geometry the shapes of space, music the mathematics of harmony, and astronomy the order of the cosmos. Together, they presented a universe that was rational, measurable, and beautiful, a reflection of a divine intellect. This education produced a uniquely prepared individual, a monk whose literacy was deep, whose mind was disciplined, and whose faith was informed by reason. The purpose of this intensive schooling was deeply practical for the monastery. It ensured a continuous pipeline of capable individuals who could step into the essential roles of the community. The brightest student with the steadiest hand might become the next master scribe in the Scriptorium. Another with a gift for analysis might become the librarian or the teacher for the next group of oblates. Those with leadership qualities could rise to become priors or even abbots. The school guaranteed the community's future by investing completely in its youth. This model, born within the cloister, would eventually step beyond its walls. The monastic school became the direct blueprint for the cathedral schools that arose in growing towns. And from those cathedral schools, with their gatherings of masters and students, the first universities would organically emerge in the 12th century. The quiet classroom of the monastery, where a young boy passed Virgil by candlelight, was the humble seed from which the great tree of Western higher education would grow. It proved a timeless principle that to save knowledge you must teach it, and in teaching you inevitably begin to expand it. Gold leaf and lapis lazuli were not paid for with prayer alone. The breathtaking beauty of an illuminated manuscript, the steady hand of a scribe, the very quiet of the scriptorium, all rested upon a foundation of remarkable economic ingenuity. A monastery was a spiritual fortress, but it was also a bustling, self-sustaining estate, one of the most sophisticated economic engines of the early medieval world. This material prosperity was the quiet, unseen pillar that made the intellectual work possible. For every hour spent copying Aristotle, countless more were spent in the fields, the workshops, and in the complex management of lands that stretched for miles. The economic lifeblood of a monastery flowed from two primary sources: pious generosity and royal patronage. Wealthy nobles and devout families, seeking spiritual merit or a symbolic place for remembrance, would donate vast tracts of farmland, forests, and villages to a monastic house. Kings and emperors like Charlemagne and his successors granted enormous estates as part of their own strategy to stabilize and Christianize their realms. With these gifts, a monastery like Cluny or St. Gall became a major landholder, a lord over villages and the people who worked them. This was not mere wealth, it was a renewable resource. The fields produced grain, the pastures fed sheep and cattle, the forests provided timber and fuel. The surplus from these lands, after feeding the monastic community itself, created a stable economic platform. Within the monastery walls, the Benedictine rule of self-sufficiency was put into daily practice. The brothers were not all scribes and scholars, many were skilled craftsmen and laborers. Some tended vast vegetable gardens and orchards within the cloister. Others worked in the bakery, the brewery, or the kitchens, transforming raw materials into food and drink. Specialized workshops produced everything from the community's woolen habits to its shoes, its candles, and the simple furniture used in the cells and refectory. Advanced monasteries often built and operated water mills along nearby rivers, grinding their own grain and sometimes milling for surrounding settlements, generating income. This internal economy minimized dependence on a fragile outside world and created a surplus of goods that could be traded. It was this surplus, this material security, that funded the life of the mind. The community could support members who did not directly contribute to food production. The scribe, the illuminator, the librarian, and the teacher were, in economic terms, non-productive. Their labor yielded no immediate harvest or tangible product. Their work was an investment in a different kind of yield, the preservation of culture. The monastery's agricultural and artisan surplus paid for their sustenance, their clothing, and their heat. More directly, it purchased the extraordinarily expensive materials of their craft. The finest parchment required the skins of hundreds of animals from the monastery's own herds or from trade. The vibrant pigments, like that precious ultramarine blue from Afghanistan, were luxury imports paid for with surplus wool, wine, or crafted goods. The gold leaf that made a page shimmer represented a measurable portion of the community's wealth, literally hammered into wisdom. This integration was the masterstroke. The intellectual project was not a separate department funded by a distant patron. It was woven into the very fabric of the community's daily survival. The monk who trimmed a quill in the Scriptorium ate bread from grain grown by his brother in the field, and wrote on parchment from a calf raised in the monastery's pasture. The entire operation formed a closed loop of productivity, where physical labor sustained spiritual and intellectual labor. Without this robust, diversified economic base, the Scriptorium would have been a fleeting dream. The patient work of copying a 1,000-page Bible, a project that could take a single scribe years, required the certainty that the community would still be there, still be fed, and still value the work when it was done. The monastery's wealth in land and labor bought that certainty, purchasing not just parchment and pigment, but the most precious commodity of all, time itself. A single monastery's library was a fortress, but a network of them formed a continent. These communities were never truly isolated silos of learning, but vital nodes in a vast, slow-moving web of connection. While their walls provided sanctuary, their gates opened onto roads of the mind that stretched across kingdoms. The most powerful tool in this network was the simple, patient art of correspondence. Monks regularly exchanged letters with brothers in distant houses, a practice that wove a fabric of shared purpose across the landscape. These letters carried more than personal news. They were vessels for theological debate, requests for communal prayers, and most crucially for our story, detailed discussions about books. A letter from an abbot in northern France might reach a colleague in Italy with a specific, urgent request. We have heard of a commentary on the Book of Revelation by the Venerable Bede, the letter might say, but our copy is damaged beyond repair. If your library holds a complete version, we humbly ask permission to send a scribe to make a new copy for our house. This was the medieval world's interlibrary loan system, operating at a pace measured in seasons, not seconds. The request itself could take weeks or months to arrive, carried by a traveling merchant, a pilgrim, or a monk on other business. The reply and the necessary permissions would travel back just as slowly. Then the real journey would begin. To fulfill such a request, the monastery would dispatch one of its own, a trusted monk, often accompanied by a companion. This scribe pilgrim would undertake a journey that could last for months, traveling on foot or by horseback along ancient Roman roads, through forests and across rivers. He carried with him not only the tools of his trade but also letters of introduction from his abbot, proving his honorable intent. Upon arrival at the distant monastery, he would be welcomed as a guest, given shelter, and brought before the librarian. There, the precious exemplar, the book to be copied, would be entrusted to him. He would then settle into the rhythm of the host community, spending his days in their scriptorium, meticulously reproducing the text page by page. This was not a transaction, it was a profound act of scholarly hospitality and shared mission. When his work was finally complete, he would begin the long journey home, carrying the new copy carefully wrapped against the elements, effectively planting a seed from one intellectual garden into another. This system was powerfully reinforced by the structure of religious orders themselves. The Benedictines, and later the Reformed Cistercians, operated as families of houses. A large, influential abbey like Cluny in France or Monte Cassino in Italy would establish daughter houses across Europe. These foundations shared the same rule, the same liturgical customs, and a deep institutional loyalty. They naturally facilitated the flow of people, ideas, and texts. A newly founded daughter house needed books to establish its own library and school, and who better to supply the core texts than its mother abbey? Scribes and teachers would travel between them, carrying the standard texts of the order and ensuring a remarkable consistency in the intellectual foundation across vast distances. This monastic network, powered by parchment, pilgrimage, and patience, created something far stronger than any single library could achieve: redundancy. A text preserved only in one place was vulnerable, but once copies existed at several other centers of learning, its survival was almost guaranteed. Knowledge preserved in one location could be duplicated and disseminated to dozens of others, creating multiple backups across the map. It was a decentralized, organic safety net for civilization's memory. The quiet exchange of a letter between two abbots and the long journey of a scribe that followed were not minor footnotes. They were the vital pulses that kept the body of learning alive across a fragmented world. The Scriptorium's quiet was a peace that could be shattered in a single morning. For all their careful planning, the monks could not wall out every danger. Their very success in creating islands of stability made them targets. From the late 8th century, a new and formidable presence appeared on the horizon: sleek ships with carved dragon heads slicing through the coastal mists. These seafarers from the north came seeking the tangible wealth they knew these holy places held. A monastery like Lindisfarne, perched on an island off England's coast, was a beacon of spiritual life, but to an outside party, it appeared as an accessible treasury. Its altar held objects of profound sacred value, crafted from precious metals, which could be seen by others as simply portable wealth. The events at Lindisfarne in the year 793 sent a profound shock through the Christian world. Here was a place of prayer and learning disrupted in a swift and overwhelming strike. The community was scattered. The library, the heart of their intellectual life, was likely consumed, its precious manuscripts lost to flame or carried away. A similar pattern touched the revered island of Iona, the mother house of Irish monasticism, which faced multiple such challenges. While these seafarers were not hunting for books, in seeking treasure, they often inadvertently destroyed a greater cultural treasure without a second thought. Fire was a constant, sleeping danger within the walls themselves. A monastery was a complex of wooden buildings, lit by candles and warmed by hearths. A single overturned lamp in the scriptorium, a stray ember from the kitchen, a lightning strike on a thatched roof, any of these could unleash a catastrophe. In an hour, a fire could consume what had taken generations of scribes to create. The library at the great abbey of Bobbio in Italy, for instance, suffered a devastating fire in the 9th century that destroyed countless unique texts. Each manuscript lost was a world closed forever, a unique voice from antiquity that would never speak again. Political conflict presented a more gradual but equally serious threat. Monasteries, with their resources and lands, were often seen as prizes. They could be caught in the middle of territorial disputes or face changes in local power. A shift in a king's favor could lead to a monastery losing its protective privileges, leaving it exposed. In these struggles, books became collateral damage, removed, used for other purposes, or simply neglected into dust. The survival of any single manuscript, therefore, was a minor miracle. It had to endure not just the slow decay of time, but the sudden disruptions brought by people and the unpredictable fury of nature. This constant vulnerability makes the overall achievement not just impressive, but almost incomprehensible. It was a project conducted on the edge of a precipice. A community could spend a century building a library of unparalleled depth, only to see it erased in a single season of turmoil. And then, what did they do? The record shows they did the only thing they could. They began again. Those who remained would regroup, often seeking a more secure site. They would reach out to sister monasteries, asking for copies of the texts they had lost. New scribes would take up their pens, and the painstaking work of replication would start over, a quiet, stubborn act of defiance against chaos. This cycle of loss and recreation is the hidden, poignant rhythm of the story. The continuity we celebrate today was not a straight, unbroken line. It was a fragile thread repeatedly severed, then patiently, faithfully, tied back together by hands that refused to let the light go out. The preserved text was no longer an artifact to be guarded, but a partner in a new kind of conversation. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the patient work of the Scriptorium had achieved something monumental. A stable library of ancient thought now existed across Europe, a shared foundation built from countless copied pages. The most powerful addition to this foundation was the complete works of Aristotle, flowing back into the West through translations from the Arabic and Greek worlds. His writings on logic, physics, and ethics presented a comprehensive, rational system for understanding nature and human life. This created an exhilarating and profound challenge. How could this powerful system of reason, developed by a philosopher from the ancient world, be reconciled with the revealed truths of Christian faith? The quiet act of preservation had, at last, created the conditions for a revolution. In the new cathedral schools rising in bustling towns and within the most intellectually vibrant monasteries, a new method took hold. It was called scholasticism, and its engine was the dialectical method, a tool of logic the monks had meticulously preserved for centuries. This was not about passive acceptance. It was about rigorous, active questioning. A master would pose a question, a quaestio, often a point of apparent tension between reason and scripture. He would then marshal all the authoritative texts, the writings of the Church Fathers alongside the arguments of Aristotle, presenting the evidence for each side. Finally, through step-by-step logical analysis, he would arrive at a resolution, a synthesis that aimed to harmonize faith and intellect. This transformed the library from a vault into an arena. Two figures embody this seismic shift. Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury, famously framed his approach as faith-seeking understanding. He began with belief, then used relentless logic to explore its foundations, arguing that even the concept of the divine could be reached through reason alone. His work demonstrated that the tools preserved in the cloister could build towering new structures of thought. Then came Peter Abelard, a brilliant, controversial teacher in Paris. His book Sic et Non, Yes and No, was a provocative manual for this new age. It presented 158 theological questions and then lined up contradictory quotations from sacred texts and the Church Fathers on each side, offering no easy answers. His purpose was to train minds in critical thinking, to wrestle with complexity, and to arrive at truth through thoughtful disputation, not mere memorization. This was the ultimate evolution of the monastic mission. The scribe's pen had saved the text. Now the scholar's mind engaged it in a living, dynamic dialogue. Monks and clerics began producing not just copies, but vast, systematic commentaries and summi, comprehensive summaries of theology and philosophy that wove ancient wisdom into a new Christian synthesis. The quiet workshop where knowledge was repaired had become a vibrant workshop where knowledge was examined and reassembled into something stronger and more nuanced. Preservation had been the necessary prelude. Now, with the foundation secure, the long silent voices of the past were finally being asked new questions, and the answers would reshape the world. The dialectical debates of the cathedral schools began to demand a permanent home. That restless intellectual energy, born in the cloister and refined in urban centers, could no longer be contained within a single master's lecture hall. In the bustling crossroads of the 12th century, a new institution was taking shape, one that would inherit the monastic mantle and carry it into the future. In cities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, loose associations of masters and students began to coalesce into a corporate body, a universitas. This was the birth of the university, and while its setting was the noisy, secular city, its soul was unmistakably shaped by the quiet monastery. The connection was direct and profound. The foundational curriculum of the new universities was the 7 liberal arts, the very trivium and quadrivium that had been the core of monastic education for centuries. The method of instruction was scholastic disputation, a formalized version of the dialectical questioning monks had practiced. The central act of learning remained the close, reverent study of authoritative texts, now called set books. The university library, though it would grow to staggering sizes, began its life as a direct descendant of the monastic armarium. Its earliest shelves were often filled with books donated from nearby abbeys or painstakingly copied from monastic exemplars. The knowledge preserved in remote communities was now being unpacked in urban lecture halls. Crucially, many of the first university professors were themselves monks or clerics, men formed in the disciplined intellectual life of the cloister. They brought with them the monastic virtues of patience, systematic study, and a deep belief in the unity of all truth. A scholar like Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican friar, would perform his monumental synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology using the very tools of logic and commentary that monastic scribes had safeguarded for the future. The university provided the new, vibrant arena, but the weapons of the mind had been forged in the Scriptorium. This transition marked a subtle but world-changing shift. The preservation and pursuit of knowledge was no longer a sacred duty confined to a religious vocation. It was becoming a professional, secular pursuit. The university was open, in principle, to any young man who could find a patron and afford the costs, dramatically widening the circle of the learned. Knowledge began to be organized into distinct faculties: law, medicine, theology, and arts, creating specialized paths of study that moved beyond the monastery's more unified vision. The flame that had been kept alive behind cloistered walls was now being used to light thousands of new lamps in the public square. The dedicated, collective work of generations of scribes had built the archive that made this explosion of thought possible. In the university's great debates, one could finally hear the full, roaring conversation that the monastery's quiet had made possible. Even the most successful revolution can grow comfortable with its own success. By the 11th century, the great Benedictine houses like Cluny had become the very centers of stability and influence they were designed to be, their liturgies magnificent, their libraries renowned, their networks of power extending across kingdoms. To some, however, this very grandeur felt like a departure from the original, stark vision of Saint Benedict. They longed for a purer, simpler life of prayer and labor, far from the political complexities the older orders now navigated. This deep yearning for reform sparked a new movement in the forests of Burgundy. In the year 1098, a small group of monks, led by Robert of Molasme, withdrew to a remote, marshy place called Cytox. Their goal was not to invent a new rule, but to return to the oldest one with uncompromising rigor. They became the Cistercians, named for their mother house, and their white habits would soon dot the landscapes of Europe, symbols of a radical commitment to simplicity. Their interpretation of the Benedictine rule was austere. They rejected the elaborate art and architecture that had come to define monastic life, building their churches from plain stone without towers or painted decoration. They moved their communities into what they called deserts, places of true wilderness far from towns and feudal estates. Manual labor, particularly agricultural work, was not just a duty but a central spiritual practice, a way to embody humility and self-sufficiency. This commitment to isolation and hard physical toil might seem, at first glance, like a turn away from the life of the mind, but the Cistercian story reveals a fascinating twist. In their pursuit of purity, they became masters of a different, profoundly practical form of intelligence. To transform their chosen wilderness into a sustainable home, they had to become engineers. A Cistercian abbey was not just a spiritual community, it was a marvel of medieval agro-industry. take the great Abbey of Clairvaux, founded by the influential Bernard. It was built in a remote valley, but the monks did not see a wasteland. They saw potential energy in the flow of water. They constructed an intricate, gravity-fed hydraulic system, a network of canals and conduits that channeled water from a nearby river to power everything on the site. This water turned mill wheels for grinding grain, drove hammers for forging iron in the workshop, managed the monastery's sanitation, and even supplied its fish ponds. At abbeys like Fountains in England, similar hydrological genius was on display, turning damp valleys into organized centers of production. This was not magic, it was applied knowledge, a deep understanding of geography, physics, and mechanics, all dedicated to supporting their contemplative life. This operational brilliance required a new kind of record-keeping. While a traditional monastery's library might highlight works of theology or philosophy, the Cistercian archive bulged with a different kind of text. They kept meticulous charters, account books, and technical memoranda. They recorded land transactions, crop yields, livestock herds, and the output of their mills and forges. Their administrative documents, often written with a clear, businesslike hand, preserved a detailed snapshot of medieval economics, law, and technology. This was knowledge of the soil, the stream, and the ledger, a vital complement to the literary heritage preserved elsewhere. So, while a Cistercian manuscript might lack the dazzling gold leaf of a Benedictine gospel, their contribution to the survival of knowledge was no less vital. They demonstrated that intelligence could be expressed not only in copying Cicero, but in calculating the slope of an aqueduct. They preserved the practical wisdom of how to build, manage, and sustain a complex community in a challenging world. In their silent, efficient abbeys, the medieval mind was learning to master its environment, proving that the preservation of civilization required not just books of philosophy, but also the blueprints for a working mill. The white-robed Cistercian in his remote valley and the black-robed Benedictine in his mountain scriptorium shared a common anchor, the stability of a place. But in the 13th century, a new kind of religious life emerged that deliberately cut that anchor line. These were the mendicant orders, the friars, whose very name comes from the Latin word for begging. They rejected the security of monastic estates and cloistered walls to live in radical poverty, moving among the people in the rapidly growing, noisy, and often chaotic cities of Europe. The two most influential were the Franciscans, followers of Saint Francis of Assisi, who embraced a life of simplicity and service to the poor, and the Dominicans, founded by Saint Dominic, whose mission was preaching and combating heresy through education. Their lifestyle was a revolution in itself, but their impact on the story of knowledge was just as profound. While they owned nothing, they became intellectual giants. The Dominicans, in particular, saw learning as their primary weapon. To preach effectively to a skeptical, urban population, and to debate complex theological challenges, they needed the sharpest minds and the deepest education. They established their own schools called studia, right in the heart of cities like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, often in close partnership with the burgeoning universities. These were not quiet retreats, but bustling hubs of debate located where the people were. The mendicants built impressive libraries within their urban convents, collecting not only religious texts but the latest works of philosophy and science. They became voracious consumers and producers of the very knowledge the older monasteries had saved. This produced one of the most towering figures of the medieval mind, the Dominican friar Thomas Aquinas. Working at the University of Paris in the 13th century, Aquinas undertook a task of breathtaking ambition. He sought to fully reconcile the newly recovered philosophy of Aristotle, with its rational, logical view of the natural world, with the revealed truths of Christian faith. His method was the scholastic disputation, honed to perfection. He would pose a question, present every possible objection with rigorous logic, often drawing on Aristotle himself, and then systematically build a resolution that wove faith and reason into a single, coherent tapestry. His monumental work, the Summa Theologica, is a vast, structured encyclopedia of thought that addressed thousands of questions about God, ethics, law, and human nature. It was a synthesis made possible only because generations of scribes had preserved Aristotle's texts, and because the new urban schools provided the arena for such intense intellectual combat. The mendicant contribution represents the final, crucial evolution in our story. The carrier of knowledge was no longer a monk bound to a specific place, but a friar walking the crowded streets. The repository was no longer a remote library in the hills, but a collection of books in a city convent, open to engagement with the vibrant, disputatious world of the university and the marketplace. Learning, once preserved in seclusion, was now being actively deployed. The mendicants used it as a tool for evangelization, yes, but also to address the urgent philosophical and social questions of a new, urban, and increasingly literate age. They took the flame that had been sheltered for centuries and carried it into the public square, using its light not just to illuminate sacred texts, but to examine all of human experience. This journey from the desert hermitage to the university lecture hall was now complete, setting the stage for a world where the preserved past would fuel an unprecedented future. The quiet victory of the Codex was a revolution in the palm of a scribe's hand. For centuries, the scroll had been the vessel of knowledge, a long, continuous sheet that one unrolled horizontally. It was elegant, but it was fragile, cumbersome, and deeply impractical for the kind of work now required. In the late ancient world, a new format had slowly gained favor, one that would become the perfect partner for the monastic mission. This was the Codex, what we recognize today as a book, with separate pages bound together at one edge and protected between two covers. Its adoption by these communities was not an accident of tradition, but a deliberate embrace of a superior technology for preservation. Consider the simple act of finding a passage. With a scroll, you had to unroll and re-roll, a physical process that stressed the material and made quick reference a tedious chore. The Codex, with its bound pages, allowed for what we now call random access. A monk could open it directly to a specific chapter, a particular psalm, or a crucial philosophical argument with ease. This transformed study from a linear procession into an active dialogue, where cross-referencing different texts became a practical reality. He could have the works of Augustine open on one desk and the letters of St. Paul on another, flipping between them to trace an idea, a practice that would have been maddeningly difficult with two unwieldy scrolls. Durability was its second silent gift. A scroll's most vulnerable points were its outer edges, where handling and unrolling caused inevitable wear. The Codex protected its contents. The bound spine and sturdy covers shielded the inner pages from direct contact and damage. When closed, the pages were pressed flat, helping to prevent curling and decay. They could be stored upright on a shelf like soldiers in ranks, taking up far less space than a collection of scrolls rolled in tubes. This compactness was a logistical miracle. The entire intellectual inheritance of a community, what might have once required a room full of scroll cases, could now be condensed onto a few shelves of codices. A monastery's library, its archive of antiquity, became a manageable, organized, and profoundly efficient system. The Codex also offered remarkable capacity. By writing on both sides of the parchment, a practice called opistography, scribes could pack twice the content into a single, portable object. A single, thick codex could contain all four Gospels, or the complete works of a church father, creating a self-contained library on a specific subject. This portability meant knowledge could travel more safely. A missionary or a scholar transferring to a new foundation could carry a small chest of codices, a veritable university in a box. In this way, the physical object itself became a kind of medieval hard drive. It was durable, searchable, high capacity, and space efficient. The monastic scribes did not just fill these codices with words, they perfected their construction, binding techniques, and organization, creating the standard form of the book for the next 1,000 years. Their choice of format was a quiet, material declaration that knowledge was meant to be used, consulted, and built upon, not merely stored and admired from a distance. The Codex was the perfect tool for a long-term project, turning scattered whispers from the past into a coherent, accessible, and enduring conversation. Yet the Scriptorium's light was not kindled only by the hands of monks. Within the sheltered cloisters of convents, a parallel and vibrant world of female scholarship flourished, its contributions often woven quietly into the margins of the larger story. Numeries were far more than simple retreats. They were dynamic centers of learning and artistic creation, where women of intellect and devotion found a rare space to cultivate their minds. The Abbey of Essen in Germany, founded and led by women of noble lineage, became renowned for its liturgical artistry and its library. At the convent of Helfta, often called the crown of German Numeries, an intense culture of mystical writing and theological study thrived in the 13th century. For many educated women, especially from aristocratic families, entering a convent was not a withdrawal from the world of ideas, but an entry into its most concentrated form. A noblewoman's dowry often included books, sometimes entire personal libraries, which she brought with her into the community. This practice helped seed the nunnery's collection with a wonderful variety of secular and sacred texts. Within these walls, nuns engaged in the same sacred crafts as their male counterparts. They served as scribes, copying psalters and devotional works with meticulous care. They became master illuminators, their needlework and manuscript paintings famed for their delicacy and expressive power. But their contribution extended beyond preservation into profound creation. Many nuns composed original works, writing down spiritual visions, theological reflections, and liturgical music. They were authors in an age that rarely afforded women a public voice, using the relative safety and stability of the cloister to record their inner experiences and intellectual insights. The most luminous example is Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century Benedictine abbess. She was a polymath whose genius refused categorization. Hildegard wrote volumes of visionary theology, composed an entire corpus of ethereal and soaring music for her sisters to sing, and authored detailed scientific and medical texts based on observation and study. Her work demonstrates that the monastic life for women could be a powerful platform for encyclopedic inquiry and leadership. While Numeries often operated under greater ecclesiastical oversight and with more limited resources than male monasteries, they carved out a vital intellectual sphere. They provided one of the few sanctioned avenues for female expression and scholarship, creating their own resilient networks where letters, books, and ideas circulated between convents. In doing so, they ensured that the preservation of knowledge was not a single-gendered endeavor, but a collective human triumph. The tapestry of this legacy is richer for every thread carefully spun in the quiet of both the monastery and the nunnery. Stone still stands where the quiet work of centuries was done. Across the hills and river valleys of Europe, the physical legacy of these hidden monasteries endures, not as forgotten ruins, but as living monuments to a timeless purpose. You can walk the same cloisters where scribes once paced in contemplation, their footsteps worn into the stone. You can stand in the Scriptorium of Melk Abbey in Austria, its grand Baroque halls now silent, and still sense the quality of light from the high windows that once illuminated 1,000 careful pages. Or you can journey to the remote tidal island of Mont Saint-Michel in France, where the abbey rises like a prayer from the sea, its very architecture a testament to the choice of isolation as a path to the divine. The thick walls speak of a world from which they sought shelter, while the soaring spaces within speak of the heights they sought to reach. In Ireland, the windswept monastic site of Clonmacnoise offers a different, more poignant connection. Here, among the stone crosses and round tower ruins by the River Shannon, you are surrounded not by grand restoration, but by eloquent absence. The outlines of churches and scriptoriums are traced in foundations on the grass. You can almost hear the echo of the bell that called the community to prayer and the rustle of vellum in a room now open to the sky. This place makes the fragility of their mission palpable. It was here, in buildings of wood and stone just like these, that the dedicated work of preservation was carried out against all odds. Many of these sites still guard the very treasures their ancestors created. In museum cases within the abbey walls, you may come face to face with a parchment page glowing with gold leaf, the handwriting so precise it seems etched yesterday. To see the actual Codex Aureus of St. Emmeram or the Book of Kells in a controlled, modern display is to witness the end point of that incredible journey of care. The object before you is the one that endured through the centuries. It is the final material proof of their success. Visiting these places does more than teach history. It allows you to feel the intentionality of a world built for a singular goal. The layout itself is a lesson. The church is central, the cloister provides a protected walkway for meditation, the chapter house for gathering, the refectory for sustenance, and the scriptorium and library, often placed for the best light and the most quiet, form the intellectual heart. Every stone was placed with a rhythm of life in mind, a rhythm that balanced prayer, labor, and study into a sustainable whole. These are not just beautiful old buildings, they are machines for preserving continuity. They remind us that the survival of knowledge was never an abstract, magical process. It was a deeply human endeavor rooted in specific, chosen places. It was made possible by walls built thick enough to keep the world's noise at bay, by windows positioned to catch the northern light for longer hours of work, by gardens planned to feed the community through winter. It was sustained by the daily, unglamorous ritual of rising for prayer, tending the fields, and then taking up the pen. The legacy is in the landscape because it was always of the landscape, drawing its strength from the solitude of a mountain, the protection of an island, or the resources of a river valley. To walk these cloisters is to understand that our shared memory was purchased not only with intellect, but with mortar, with patience, and with an unwavering sense of purpose carved into the very stone. Their legacy is not simply a collection of old books, but the very shape of our modern mind. The hidden monasteries of that era were far more than religious retreats. They were the emergency backup system for Western civilization itself. When the lights of the ancient world flickered, these communities became the quiet, distributed servers that kept the core data of philosophy, science, and literature from a catastrophic wipe. Through an unlikely fusion of spiritual discipline, architectural strategy, economic ingenuity, and sheer manual effort, generations within these communities performed the critical, unglamorous work of copying, correcting, and caring for the written word. They did not just store knowledge, they actively maintained it, line by line, through centuries of uncertainty. This was preservation as a sacred verb, a continuous act of faith in a future they would never see. They saved a fragile, single thread of understanding from being severed forever. That thread, patiently strengthened and multiplied across a continent, would later be woven into the rich tapestry of the Renaissance, providing the very texts that inspired a rediscovery of human potential. It would fuel the reasoned debates of the scientific revolution, offering the ancient foundations upon which new theories could be built. In a very real sense, the intellectual architecture of our modern world rests upon the parchment foundations they laid. Every time we engage with a classical idea, benefit from a legal principle, or admire a work of art inspired by antiquity, we are touching the outcome of their silent labor. Their story teaches us a profound and urgent lesson that preservation is not a passive state but an active, deliberate choice. It is often undertaken not by famous leaders in times of glory, but by unsung heroes in times of quiet crisis. It is found in the daily decision to care for something fragile, to invest precious resources in something that offers no immediate reward, and to commit to a task whose full value will only be realized long after. This challenges the very notion of a dark age, revealing it not as a period of emptiness, but as an epoch of tenacious, focused guardianship. It was not dark in the places where the scribe's candle burned. If this journey through the scriptoria and cloisters has reshaped your understanding of how knowledge endures, consider subscribing for more explorations into the hidden forces that quietly built our present. We would love to hear your reflections in the comments below. Given this incredible rescue mission, which single ancient text or idea are you most grateful survived its long passage through the care of these dedicated keepers?